In this video, we're going to kind of summarize everything we talked about so far with transformations of linear functions. So this chart very nicely puts together everything that we talked about with linear transformations. If f of x becomes f of x plus k, the graph will move up or down. If f of x becomes f of x plus h, the graph will move left or right. If f of x becomes c times f of x, it'll be a vertical stretch or compression. If f of x becomes f of kx, we'll have a horizontal compression or a stretch. If f of x becomes negative f of x, we have a reflection over the x-axis. And if f of x becomes f of negative x, we reflect over the y-axis. So let's kind of review these. If we have f of x plus k, and if k is bigger than 0, the graph will move up k. If k is less than 0, the graph will move down k. If we have f of x plus h, and if h is greater than 0, the graph will move left. If h is less than 0, the graph will move right. If we have c times f of x, and if the absolute value of c is bigger than 1, the graph will be vertically stretched, which means that will become more steep. If the absolute value of c is between 0 and 1, the graph will be vertically compressed, which means that it will be less steep. If we have f of kx, and if k is bigger than 1, the graph will be horizontally compressed, which means the graph will be more steep. If we have k is less than 1, the graph will be horizontally stretched, which means the graph will be less steep. If we have negative f of x, that graph will be reflected over the x-axis. If we have f of negative x, the graph will be reflected over the y-axis. So let's think about y equals 4x and y equals 4x minus 3. What effect does subtracting 3 have on the graph? So we want to kind of think about this in terms of f of x, right? So we have f of x equals 4x, and then we have like f of x basically minus 3. So this is like a minus k kind of situation, right? We have a minus k, so that means that my graph is going to be shifted down 3. So that is exactly what it tells us in the chart, and we can see that's what happens if we look at the two graphs. The original graph in red, you can see, is shifted down by 3 units to form the new graph, which is in blue. So what if we have a sequence of transformations that goes from f to g? So in this case, f of x equals 4x minus 1, and then we have g of x equals 4x plus 1. Well, what happens? This minus 1 became a plus 1, right? So that means that basically I added 2 to my graph, right? So f of x plus 2 equals g of x, right? Because if I do that, if I add 2 to this function, I actually get 4x plus 1. So that is why f of x plus 2, so that means that I have k equals 2. So that means my graph moves up 2 units. If I graph both functions, I can see that this is in fact true. So let's graph f of x equals x and g of x equals negative 3x minus 1 and describe the transformations from the graph of f of x to the graph of g of x. Well, there's a lot going on here, right? Because f of x is x, and then g of x is negative 3x minus 1. Well, let's think about what happens to x to get to here. Well, first, x gets multiplied by 3, right? So we have 3 times f of x, which equals 3x. So 3 times f of x, so what happens is we have a value of c in front, so c is bigger than 1, so this graph will become vertically stretched, right? That is the first change that I have. I have a vertical stretch, which means my graph is more steep. Okay, now let's think about second change. So second change is this is negative, right? So this is going to be negative 3f of x. So that's negative 3x, right? So the negative is actually going to make it reflected over the x-axis, right? Because that's what happens when f of x goes to negative f of x. So now what else is happening? Well, I have a minus 1, right? So I took negative 3f of x, and then I subtracted 1, and that's how I get negative 3x minus 1. So the third change means that I did a minus 1, so that's my value of k. So since k is less than 1, that means that I moved down 1 unit. So those are the three transformations that take f of x to g of x. If we graph both equations, we can see that's true. So you can see f of x is in red, right? So the first thing that we said that happens is that it's more steep. So more steep, and we can see, in fact, the graph in blue is more steep. Okay, it's also reflected over x, which is the second thing we said would happen, right? We said it would be reflected over the x-axis, which is true. And then the third change we said is that it moves down 1 unit. Okay, so it moves down 1, which we can see it's true. We can see that this point right here moved down 1, and all the points on this graph are shifted down by 1. So those are the transformations that take f of x to g of x. So remember to use this summary chart whenever you're solving problems. That'll help you remember the transformations and what are the effects on the graph.